to Victor. Victor, you've got an extraordinary, an extraordinary life story, but also you do extraordinary work, particularly in context of conflict, trying to provide psychosocial support, in particular working with psychologists to work with the trauma of conflict. And you've done that work across the African continent in extraordinary and profound ways. And I know that you've also begun a process of connecting with the experience of sort of the frontline psychology community in Ukraine. I'd love to hear from you, your perspective on reflecting from your experience of conflict through to the work you're doing in Ukraine. What are these connections between Africa and Ukraine? What are the ways in which perhaps the story is more complicated than just the geopolitics tells us?
Yes, thank you so much, Janet, and my colleagues, the two previous speakers, and Mama Gracia for amazingly the most motherly statement that could come from the planet right now. And I want to, again, in the same tone, in the same spirit, also highlight clearly from our side, as you ask, having been directly involved in conflict zone, having been a war survivor myself. And I think, to begin with, I would say it is very difficult for something good to come out of life lived in war, especially if you're a young person, a child, or a young person. It's really difficult because your biggest fear is if your parents, whom you entirely rely upon, will be taken away from you. In the same spirit, the children will be wondering the same if our sisters and brothers whom we totally love them would be taken away from us. The same with the parents will be wondering if the children we love so dearly would be taken away from us. So the life in war is a life of fear, a life of pain, and it's a life of despair. And sometimes you wonder if really you are the only one. Why would the whole world turn up against you? From our side in Uganda, having lived in conflict and living in the internally displaced people's camp for over 20 years, spending the childhood in conflict, wondering how life would ever look like ever, it reached a point that we couldn't afford to accept our reality, but also the question was, how much do we see change can happen in our community? And that's why we thought about, can we transform our trauma, our pain, and our suffering into an opportunity for leadership and leadership for peace? And that's why we took it upon to say, let us step forward and pursue a meaningful and dignified life as people have been through war, but only not our life, but also life of other people. So the whole question became, how do we heal the physical wounds? How do we heal the emotional wounds? And how do we heal historical wounds? Otherwise, without that, there's a prospect for intergenerational transfer of trauma. The senior leaders, after going through all the years of pain, will transfer the trauma to their young generation, to their young children, that we're living in pain, we're suffering because of them. Had it not been because of this community, had it not been because of this tribe, this country would have been in a better condition. So that generational transfer of trauma becomes the essence, the clear ingredients of endless cycles of injustice. So yes, that's why we came up with the African Youth Initiative, primarily to help us mobilize ourselves as people, survivors of war, to work among ourselves, to mobilize ourselves, to become actors for peace and change and justice in our community. Unfortunately, the similar call we grew up hearing when we were children, that pick up the gun, fight the enemies, attack the attackers, when we were children, is the tone I hear today in many conflicts, not only in Ukraine, but also in conflict around other parts of the world, because our color has made us become enemies of the next person. Our language, our history has divided us and become the tools for injustice. So, driven by our own experience, we know what it means to be victims of war. We know what it means to be hurt. We understand what bombardment look like, how it feels, and also what displacement looks like. And of course, this has been the journey that we have gone again and again. We have supported communities in the continent. We have supported young people in the continent, but also all over the other parts of the world. Most importantly, when war broke up in Ukraine, we were approached by our colleagues, psychiatrists and psychologists, the psych communities who are working with victims and survivors of war, seeking for our support, especially on handling cases of children who are affected by war. We have children who are separated by war. We have children who have seen their parents being brutalized or sexually abused during war. And also we have seen women who have been made victims of sexual violence, victims of rape as a weapon of war. This has continued to happen, and this has been a challenge all over the world. But we have been contacted to share our experience. Of course, in as important as they approached us, we also felt so bad that situations like this can still continue in the world of today. But from our side, we know healing the wound would mean a lot if we focus on the plight of the people. Of course, the current discussion is, where is Africa in the picture of war between Ukraine and Russia? Where is Africa? But I think when we come to this platform, we are not here to choose which side is right or wrong. We are here to stand for what is good for the victims, to protect the people who are affected directly by war. And that's really what we stand for. Because it would be difficult for us to think of, what we are seeing today is the heavy amount of the toxic militarism we see in the world today is fundamentally unjust. And I remember at some point in 2014, when we met with the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he did say something that I see happening today. When Arch said, you, the young people, young Africans, prepare yourself to lead the world. And we asked him why. And he said, each time in the human history the world is in need, they look up to Africa for support. And in this case, it happened during the Egyptian era. It happened during a time when the world was looking for assets to build infrastructure. They came and colonized the continent. It happened when the world was looking for manpower. They came and took slaves from the continent. And he did say that right now the world is so militarily capable of destroying each other. It will reach a point when the world will need a nuclear weapons-free continent to step in between. And that is Africa. So today I see that the only continent with the potential of bringing possibly alternative. What we know is we've been through the African resilience platform, that we have gone through journeys of trauma, of pain, of suffering, but we have continued to live. We have seen in a continent where even some most vicious war criminals became presidents and they're in power. So the question is, what is that is unique in Africa that has helped us to get along, even though we have our own challenges? Of what we are not right. Sexual violence as a weapon is not only a deadly, unfortunate reality. It's a multi-generational and a multi-stakeholder trauma that needs countering, that needs supporting. The child soldiering, the child's conscription of what we are seeing all over the world, not only in one part of the continent or in one part of the world, but all over the world. It's a multi-generational crisis that we are not addressing. We are trying to walk away from the decades that we have gone through, the stains of the bloodsheds and suffering due to rape, and to the extent that dialogue almost means nothing because we are so capable to destroy each other. But what we are saying, comes back to the sense of humility, the sense of humanity, which Mama Gracia also already emphasized on that. Regardless of which side of war anybody's view stands in, we have to care for people who are powerless, the weak, and the vulnerable. And I think something that we saw, the response we saw in the Ukraine-Russian war, exposed the post-colonial fragility and vulnerability of humanitarian response in the global crisis.